I'm Ryan O'Doud, and you're listening to Ryan's Audiobooks on the Issues Magazine YouTube channel. Today we continue with the Russian Cosmists, the Esoteric Futurism of Nikolai Fedderov and his followers. We're moving on to section 1112, chapter 12, Cosmism and its offshoots today. During the Soviet period, as we have seen, the major religious cosmists either worked in exile, such as Berdayev and Bulgakov, or were restricted, suppressed, and eventually liquidated, as were Florensky, Gorsky, Setsnitsky, and Murvayev. The scientific cosmists, Tsiolkovsky, Vernadsky, Chizevsky, and Kuprovich, were honored for their work in fields that did not contradict the tenets of dialectical materialism, but were attacked in official publications for their cosmic speculations, which went beyond orthodox materialism, and which either had to be kept in a drawer, expressed in private communications, or circulated through unofficial channels. With the lessening and eventual end of Soviet restrictions in the 1980s, hidden works from earlier periods began to come out, and along with other formerly suppressed activities and forms of expression, new waves of cosmist research and speculation began to flourish. The N.F. Fedorov Museum Library. The central institution for the study and propagation of Russian Cosmism today is the N.F. Fedorov Museum Library, housed in the Central Children's Library on Pro-Soyuznaya Street in Moscow. The idea for a special museum devoted to Fedorov and his intellectual heirs developed through seminar on Fedorov in the 1980s, directed at the philosopher and literary scholar Svetlana Semenova, who has been writing about Fedorov's ideas since the 1970s. Her cautious early studies emphasized Fedorov's faith in advanced science and technology, and downplayed the religious and political sides of his thought. In 1982, she edited the first official Soviet edition of Fedorov's writings, a one-volume selection of his major essays revealing the entire range of his thought. Biographical and analytical works followed, all of which generated controversies, polemics, denunciations, and at the same time a growing respect for Fedorov's contribution to Russian intellectual history, his stature as a native fatherland Otechestveni thinker. In 1988, Semenova. Editor's note, I apologize, as the source material is missing a page or two. I will continue to the next section. These and other similar papers, published after conferences, are merely the tip of the iceberg. Panels, roundtables, commemorations, video presentations, and displays supplement the individual papers delivered. Participants include academics in the humanities, natural sciences, and social sciences, from Russian and international institutes and universities, independent scholars, writers, artists, journalists, and government officials, and at the sessions I have attended, all the seats have usually been filled. Co-sponsors with the Fedorov Museum Library are the Russian National Library, where Fedorov worked when it was the Rumyantsev Museum, the Russian Academy of Sciences, the Gorky Institute of World Literature, and the Philosophy Department of the University of Moscow. The proceedings of these conferences are considered important enough to have been reported in major Russian newspapers and journals and broadcast on television, all indicating the degree to which Fedorov and the Cosmists have been accepted into the historical mainstream of Russian intellectual culture. In addition to sponsoring scholarly conferences and publications for intellectuals, the Fedorov Museum Library works to integrate Fedorovian and Cosmist ideas into the general popular culture of post-Soviet Russia. Following the Russian tradition of celebrating many anniversaries and holidays, whether on the church, cultural, or political calendar, the Fedorov Museum Library lets no date relevant to Cosmism pass, without an announcement on the website, an interview in the media, or some kind of event open to the public. The Fedorov website's announcements for April 2011 list Berdyaev's memorial, Vernadsky's birthday, the beginning of Galileo's trial, the granting of a charter for the Russian Museum, Astronomy Day, the inauguration of Runet, the Russian internet system, the restoration of Moscow as the national capital, International Writers' Day, all dates of special significance but of secondary importance to the two major Cosmist celebrations of the month, Easter and the 50th anniversary of Yuri Gagarin's pioneering flight into the cosmos. In Cosmist terms, these two celebrations are related, spiritual and scientific commemorations of human victory over gravity and death. In addition to Smirnova and Gacheva, other people regularly associated with the Fedorov Museum Library carry on their own independent Cosmist projects. Independent researcher Valery Borisov, for example, has tracked down every house, apartment, or closet that Fedorov occupied during his nearly 40 years in Moscow, and will gladly conduct visitors to as many of these places as they wish to see. Borisov, who in his rust-colored leather jacket, Australian outback hat, and bare-chested open shirt, even, or especially in frozen winter blasts, stands out in any Moscow crowd, has defied all bureaucratic, hooliganistic, and other organized and inorganized opposition to create a unique Cosmist garden in a courtyard of the large Moscow housing block which he lives. Not only flowers, but leaves, limbs, rocks, and other natural objects are arranged symbolically to represent microcosmic, macrocosmic harmony and the human ability to transform an ugly patch of the urban environment to a small paradise. Videos, newspapers, and magazines have publicized Valerie's garden, perhaps encouraging others to undertake similar projects, and other creative minds and hands have been at work. As we have noted, Fedorov never allowed himself to be photographed or painted during his lifetime, but his portrait is now often seen in various illustrations, plaques, sculptures, magazines, and newspapers, and even on the lapel pins that Russians of all ages like to wear. Working together then and through others, Smirnova and Gacheva have campaigned to win both academic and popular respect for Fedorov and the Cosmists, and to make the Fedorov Museum Library an active center for the common task in Moscow. The Tsiolkovsky Museum and Chizevsky Center. Beyond Moscow, Cosmist enters in St. Petersburg, Voronezh, Kiev, Astana, and elsewhere carry on similar activities on a smaller scale. But the center outside Moscow that seems most active is the Konstantin E. Tsiolkovsky Museum for the History of Cosmonautics in the adjoining A.L. Chizevsky Center in the small city of Kaluga. Annual conferences there, like the ones in Moscow, touch on every aspect of Cosmism, but with an emphasis on Cosmism in relation to Tsiolkovsky and cosmonautics, rather than Fedorov and the task of resurrecting the ancestors. Typically, conferences focus on such topics as the study of Tsiolkovsky's scientific heritage, problems of rocketry and space technology, space flight mechanics, problems of space medicine, biology and aviation and aeronautics, Tsiolkovsky and philosophical problems of space exploration, Tsiolkovsky and scientific forecasting, Tsiolkovsky and the problems of space industry, Tsiolkovsky and the problems of cosmonauts' activities, Tsiolkovsky and the problems of education. While the Tsiolkovsky Museum conference emphasizes cosmonautics, Tsiolkovsky's great-grandson Sergei Samburov, who also lives in Kaluga, is the individual now most responsible for the propagation of Tsiolkovsky's philosophical and cosmist speculations. It is thanks to Samburov's efforts that works unpublished during Tsiolkovsky's lifetime are now coming to light, and we can begin to see what a strange and distant future the Kaluga eccentric envisioned. Tsiolkovsky, along with Vernadsky, Chizevsky, and Kuprovich, is still considered to have been a major figure in what is now termed classical scientific cosmism. We shall now turn to the new scientific cosmism that has emerged since the end of the Soviet period. Esoteric, Institute for Scientific Research in Cosmic Anthropoecology. I like that. Since the early 1990s in Novosibirsk, Siberia, under the aegis of the Russian Academy of Sciences, the Institute for Scientific Research in Cosmic Anthropology has been conducting experiments on esoteric aspects of human perception of time and space, specifically investigating telepathic communications not only between human subjects, but also between human subjects and inanimate objects, and between human subjects on Earth and unidentified forces in the cosmos. Alexander Trofimov, the current director, and Vlail Kaznashev, the senior scientist, based their experiments in part on Vernadsky's theories of the noosphere, but mainly on research conducted through the Soviet period by the brilliant but extremely controversial astrophysicist Nikolai Kozyrev. Both as a very promising young scientist who published his first paper at age 17, and as an elder honored statesman of Soviet science, Kozyrev made important discoveries about the properties of the Moon, Venus, and other bodies in our solar system. He won international medals and awards, and an asteroid and moon crater are named for him. In 1936, however, denounced by a disgruntled graduate assistant, Kozyrev was arrested and sentenced to 10 years in the Gulag for counter-revolutionary activity. During his imprisonment, he apparently associated with inmates who were Siberian shamans, and he began to see connections between his work as a scientist and their spiritual activities. Observing the night sky from the prison camp in remote Siberia, he sensed that the stars were alive and communicating among themselves and somehow also communicating with him. On his release from prison in 1946, Kozyrev's research took new directions, and his investigations into the nature of time and causality, enormously controversial then, have provided theoretical basis for today's experiments at Esoteric. Time, according to Kozyrev's theory, is a spiraling movement of energy torsion waves pervasive throughout the cosmos. The spiraling energy manifests itself in phenomena as disparate as the spiral of the nautilus shell and the location of the heart on the left side of the human body. Kozyrev's theory reinstates the ether as a fluid medium of energy underlying everything in the universe, a Western scientific equivalent of chi, prana, akasha, and other concepts borrowed by Western esotericists from non-Western sources. Kozyrev and the Esoteric scientists posit that in the remote past all living entities in the cosmos shared through the ether a common consciousness and were in constant telepathic communication regardless of physical location or distance. In today's world, only certain mystics and shamans retain this ability to communicate telepathically at will, but the potential exists for all humans to recover this lost ability. The Esoteric experiments, Kaznashev and Trofimov have discovered that the weaker the surrounding magnetic field, the stronger the sense of oneness with the cosmos and the greater the likelihood of telepathic communication. With this in mind, they have devised the Kozyrev mirror, a line cylinder in which a resting or meditating subject can experience something like a shamanic cosmic consciousness and can perhaps communicate telepathically not only with other remote human subjects, but also with seemingly inanimate objects, including distant planets and stars. In addition to expanding human consciousness, the Kozyrev mirror has been used to treat physical and psychological disorders and to modify the chemical composition of inanimate and inanimate objects. Susan Richards, a British writer who participated in a Kozyrev Mirror session, gives a vivid account of her experience. What happened next takes me to the very edge of the sayable. After lying in the dark for a while, my heart started leaping about like a cricket in a box. Then everything went calm and the images began. A dark column seemed to rise out of my forehead. I found myself standing in a deep, dark canyon. This canyon came and went, alternating with a spiral. When that faded away, a brightly covered fairground carousel appeared. There were people riding the whirling wooden trains, cars, and animals. It was a merry scene, at least to start with. But even as I watched, something started going wrong. The movement of the carousel became chaotic and alarming. The painted wooden animals and engines were slipping. The center was not holding, it was falling apart. Then the sequence faded, and I found myself back at the bottom of that great dark spiral, which in turn evolved back into a crevasse. Black rocks rose up on either side, and there was light streaming down on me. I basked in the light. This I wanted never to end, but eventually this image faded too. I lay not knowing where my body finished and the world outside began. Everything around me seemed to be spun out of light. The rhythm of my breathing seemed to have changed. It was as if I was learning to breathe for the first time, learning to support this lightness of being through the way that I breathed. Without smoking, swallowing, injecting, or otherwise ingesting any kind of chemical substance, Susan Richards has described the fluidity of boundaries, the oneness with surroundings, and the waves of warm light that characterize many classic accounts, from Samuel Taylor Coleridge to Aldous Huxley and Carlos Castaneda, of experience both benign and scary with hallucinogenic drugs. Special in her account, though, is the sense of spirals, which would seem to indicate a genuine connection between the subject's experience of being whirled by something and Kozyrev's theory of what we are all whirled by. Susan Richards seems to have been a very sensitive subject, as well as a writer exceptionally able to find words and images to articulate her experiences at the very edge of the sayable. Others who have tried the same experiment, like the filmmaker George Carey, have either felt nothing or had a mostly negative or incommunicable experience. But just as Cosmism in Kaluga now stands for research into the exploration of outer space, Cosmism in Esoteric emphasizes the exploration of inner space. Like the Kaluga Cosmists Tsiolkovsky and Shizevsky, the Esoteric Cosmists believed that waves of energy from distant stars created life on Earth. But Esoteric research suggests that we do not have to leave our planet, or even Siberia, to experience life and communicate with living entities throughout the cosmos. Lev Nikolaevich Gumilev, 1912 to 1992, and Neo-Eurasianism. Although himself neither a Fedorovian nor a Cosmist, Lev Gumilev was a polymath thinker whose works reflect some of Fedorov's ideas and are frequently cited by recent Cosmist thinkers and scholars. The only son of two of the greatest Russian poets of the 20th century, Nikolai Gumilev and Anna Akhmatova, Lev Gumilev was a writer of profound erudition and equally profound creativity and imagination. Too broad in his interests and expertise to be pigeonholed into a single academic category, Gumilev wrote as a general humanist whose major investigations were into ethnic identity, mass human migration, and the rise and fall of civilizations, hordes, and tribes of the Eurasian continent. Like other prominent unorthodox thinkers of the period, he spent his middle years, 1938 to 1956, in one of Stalin's concentration camps. The first half of his sentence he would later say for being the son of his father, and the second half for being the son of his mother, both major dissident intellectuals, the father executed and the mother persecuted for anti-Soviet behavior. After release from prison, Gumilev worked at the Hermitage and took special interest in the Great Museum's collections of Scythian and Central Asian artifacts. He took part in archaeological expeditions to the Caucasus and the Central Asian steppes, learned the languages of various Mongol and Turkic peoples of the steppe regions, and wrote his first books on nomadic migrations, the quest for the imaginary kingdom of Prester John, the ancient Turks, and the steppe as a major factor in Russian history. Whether consciously or unconsciously, Gumilev's ideas of the importance of the steppe in Central Asia to Russian culture and history reflect Fedorov's ideas about Russia's virtues as a land-cultivating Eurasian continental power, in opposition to the insular and peninsular land-seeking powers in history, such as Greece and Rome in ancient times and Britain and Japan in the present. In Fedorov, geography is a major factor in ethnic and national character. Gumilev develops these ideas further, presenting the migrations of great Central Asian peoples as the main event in both European and Asian history. Geography in Eurasia, the steppe, is a dominating factor in the emergence of any ethnos or people. To explain the rise and fall of tribes, kingdoms, and ethnic groups, Gumilev introduces the concept of passionarity, the intensity of a given group's ethnic identity and vitality, the energy in its will to power. Like some of the Cosmists, Gumilev views passionarity as, in part, energy derived, at least indirectly, from solar and other extraterrestrial sources. For example, solar winds and rays influence the growth of grass in the steppe, and the abundance or insufficiency of grazing grass influences the stationary or migratory behavior patterns of the steppe peoples and contributions to the intensity of the identification with ethnic values and traditions, whether warlike or peaceful, nomadic or sedentary. In the modern world, Gumilev believed that Western Europe was low and sinking further in passionarity, while in the Turkic and Arab Muslim peoples, passionarity was significantly higher and still rising. Russia's future as an international power lay not in emulating the Western European and Atlantic powers with their diminishing passionarity, but instead in gathering and uniting the passionarity of the steppe people in the East. Fedorov viewed Russian culture as a continuation of ancient Aryan Iran. An editor's note: this should be taken with a grain of salt. It's beginning to sound like ethno-nationalist bullshit. A combination of Eastern and Western principles, struggling against a hostile native environment, wary of Greco-Roman power to the west and Turan to the east. Similarly, Gumilev views Russia as the absorber and continuation of the great steppe powers of ancient Eurasia, different from and stronger than both Western Europe and Eastern Asia. For Gumilev, the Mongol invasion by Genghis Khan was not a curse but a blessing for Russia, saving the entire Eurasian heartland from the aggressive clutches of the Catholic West, then represented by Poland and the Baltic Teutonic Knights. Under the Khans, Russian Orthodox spirituality was tolerated and allowed to mature, whereas medieval Orthodox spirituality would have been crushed under the heels of the Teutonic Knights, and the Eurasian heartland would eventually have become simply an extended version of the European spiritual and political battleground of Catholics versus Protestants. Gumilev's views have been a major influence on the Neo-Eurasian cultural and political movements prominent since the breakup of the Soviet Union. And although he seldom mentions Fedorov, Gumilev renews themes from the earlier classical Eurasian movement among émigré Russians in Berlin and Paris during the 1920s and 30s, a movement which featured such thinkers as the philosopher Prince Nikolai Chubetskoy, the literary historian Prince Mirsky, the historian George Vernadsky, the political activist P.N. Savitsky, the Fedorovian K. Chehaidze, and Marina Svetlana's husband Sergei Efron. These, Evrazitsky as they call themselves, openly acknowledged their debt to Fedorov, debated in their journals whether Marx or Fedorov presented the better model for future Russian development, concluded that Marx might offer the best plan for 20th century, but Fedorov would best serve the 21st century and beyond. Gumilev draws some of his ideas from these earlier Evrazitsky, but especially in his major work, Ethnogenesis and the Biosphere of Earth, also draws upon some of the Cosmists, including Vernadsky's ideas of the biosphere and noosphere, and Chizevsky's ideas of the influence of variations in waves of solar energy on human history. In recent times, Gumilev's theories have proved especially useful to Russian neo-nationalists, neo-Eurasianists, and others with an anti-Western, anti-Atlanticist political bias, the most prominent of whom is the ideologist Alexander Dugin, and some might add Vladimir Putin. Editor's note, there it is. In addition to Gumilev, Fedorov too has been viewed as a source not only for Russian neo-nationalist thought but also for the renewed Russian admiration for Stalin. Edmund Griffiths, in a recent Times Literary Supplement essay, suggests that Alexander Prokhanov and other recent literary patriots have adopted a Gnostic worldview in which all outer exoteric phenomena contain hidden esoteric significance, and surprisingly, the esoteric core of Stalinism turns out to be Fedorovism. According to Prokhanov, communism is not an enormous patchwork quilt for all humanity to sleep under. It is not a machine that yields an infinite quantity of goods. It is not an honor board with photographs of shock workers. It is the defeat of death. The whole pathos of Soviet futurology and Soviet technocratic thought was directed at creating an elixir of immortality. As the early Fedorovians of the first decades of the 20th century looked forward with hope, so Prokhanov and other neo-nationalists and post-Soviet communist intellectuals today look back with nostalgia on the ideas that Soviet rule meant the adoption of Fedorov's common task. As Griffiths writes, part of the attraction of Prokhanov's esoteric Futurism, undoubtedly, is that it preserves the orientation towards the radiant future so characteristic of Soviet thinking. For the neo-nationalists, the possibility of that radiant future, the potential restoration of Eden, came crashing down in 1991. For them, as Putin has repeatedly stated, the demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest disaster of the 20th century. Griffiths goes on to point out that, true to the Gnostic pattern, in every collapse of an Eden, a serpent is found to be involved. In current Russian neo-nationalist political theater, the Jews, the Chechens, and the Atlanticists are often cast as the serpent. Fedorov and the Cosmists, Florensky perhaps the exception, do not generally share current neo-nationalistic tendencies towards anti-Semitism, but they do, except Solovyov, generally share the anti-Western, anti-Atlanticist views inherited from the Russian Slavophile tradition. An interesting feature of Prokhanov's attempt to link Stalinism to Fedorovism is that it shows the degree to which Fedorovism is now accepted as a positive model for the native, quote, Otechestvenaya tradition of Russian thought. Stalin may have ordered the murder of millions, but he is justified because secretly he was a Fedorovian. A thinker whose name could not be mentioned in public is now used to support the rehabilitation of the one who made his name unmentionable. But as we shall see, this is not the only strange use to which the ideas of Fedorov and the Cosmists have recently been put. The Hyperboreans. Along with Gumilev, another prominent unorthodox scholar with at least some direct connection to the Cosmist movement is Valery Demin, a proponent of a Russian version of the Arctos theory, designating the Hyperborean extreme north as the original homeland of the Indo-Europeans, and perhaps all other peoples. Demin's 1997 Moscow University doctoral dissertation was more than 20 books and 100 shorter works. The dissertation was titled Philosophical Principles of Russian Cosmism, and he's the author of more than 20 books and 100 shorter works, including essays and cosmist collections about the peoples, legends, history, and prehistory of the far north. He has conducted meteorological research and led archaeological expeditions in the Russian Arctic, and is a leading spokesman for the Hyperborean offshoot of today's Russian Cosmist movement. Basing their theories on the writings of Herodotus, Pliny, Ptolemy, and other ancient authorities, and supported by modern research including Fedorov's speculations on the origins of civilization in the Pamir Mountains, and Baal Gangadhar Talak's writings on the far northern origins of the Vedas, Demin and the Hyperboreans argue that the Arctic, which had a much milder climate some 40,000 years ago, was a kind of northern Shambhala, or perhaps a prototype for Plato's Atlantis. In any case, the original homeland of a happy, healthy people who live far beyond present lifespans. In Fedorov's theory, the invisible Mount Meru, the universal axis of Indian mythology, rises above the North Pole, and the Pamir Mountains in Central Asia represent an earthly manifestation of the cosmic center. Fedorov found that in local legends, Adam's bones were said to be buried in the Pamirs, so the Pamirs stand for the grave of all humanity, the buried original ancestral dust in need of resurrection, a former paradise that is now an uninhabitable wasteland in need of restoration. For Fedorov, the Pamirs in history have been the Earth's center of repulsion, from which the original Indo-Europeans and later the Mongol and other nomadic hordes fled, bringing death and destruction to their settled neighbors. Damien essentially changes the earthly manifestation of Mount Meru from Fedorov's Pamirs to Hyperborea, citing petroglyphs, fossil evidence, linguistic keys, shifts in polar magnetism, legends of unsetting suns and unrelived darkness, and other data to argue that the original Indians, Aryans, Cretans, and other cultural forebears all migrated south from Hyperborea. In Damien's version, the Golden Age, featured in the legends of nearly all peoples, eventually took place in the Arctic. A great cataclysm, possibly caused by abrupt changes in solar or stellar energy, best known to us as the Biblical Flood, variants of which are also recorded in the legends of nearly all the world's peoples, drove Hyperborean survivors to settle elsewhere and to bring with them their history, symbols, skills, and language. Originally one people, one culture, and one language, the Hyperboreans over time split and dispersed into the many peoples, languages, and cultures we know today. The shared feature of many peoples, religions, and cultures separated by significant difference. For example, pyramids in Egypt, Mesoamerica, and perhaps in Bosnia are relics from Hyperborea. For Damien and his followers, Russians and other Europeans should no longer think of themselves as out of Africa, but down from Hyperborea. In recent years, at midsummer and on other astrologically significant occasions, groups of Russians who might be described as Hyperborean reenactors, have gathered for neo-pagan ceremonies in the far north. Perhaps Russian equivalents of the neo-Druidic ceremonies at Stonehenge. On one of the websites devoted to Hyperboreanism, Damien attributes to the ancient Hyperboreans some 30 qualities, which he deems positive, ranging from happy disposition to blonde hair and vegetarian diet. The photos of the Neo-Hyperboreans, mostly of radiant young women in diaphanous white gowns with flowers in their hair, would suggest that the reenactors are carefully selected to illustrate every one of these 30 positive qualities. Like other cosmists, the Hyperboreans look forward to a restoration of a lost golden age, one people, one language, one culture, all good, all healthy, all youthful again, and forever. As Damien's list of 30 qualities emphasizes, there were no evil, ugly, or unhealthy people in ancient Hyperborea, and presumably there will be no defective individuals or groups in the new Hyperborea to be created. Yeesh. In the vision of Hyperborea, past and future, Damien is content to project only the most positive images and does not attempt to explain how all that is negative in us and in the world will be eliminated. Scientific immortalism. One of the most active branches of today's Russian Cosmist movement is scientific immortalism, which, with different personnel, different localities, and perhaps slightly different emphasis, also operates as transhumanism, cryonicism, scientific anabiosis, and perhaps other names as well. Essentially, all these terms represent the search for a technological, physical, material solution to the problem of death. With little or no recognition of possible spiritual realities. Though they participate in Cosmist conferences, publish in Cosmist collections of papers, and often cite Fedorov, Tsiolkovsky, and Vernadsky as predecessors, Russian scientific immortalists generally have more in common with international movements of similar orientation than with the traditional Russian Cosmin mixture of mystery, technology, and spirituality. They participate in international symposia, sometimes teach or lecture abroad, and invite European and American colleagues to contribute to their colloquia and group publications. In their writings, Russian scientific immortalists are as likely to cite the Swedish transhumanist Nick Bostrom or the American futurologist Ray Kurzweil as Fedorov or Vernadsky. Everything in their view, even thoughts of love and memories of childhood, can ultimately be understood as matter and energy, chemical and electrical impulses and interchanges. Mind is nothing but operations of the physical brain. When our body dies, our life is over. Scientific immortalists would not endorse Walt Whitman's assertion that we are not contained between our hats and our boots. A major figure in this branch of Cosmism is Igor Vishev, who at age 14 suffered a totally and permanently blinding chemical accident, but who with great courage and energy has engaged in a lifelong pursuit of learning, first as a student at Moscow State University and eventually as a professor of philosophy at the Chelyabinsk Polytechnic Institute. He's led a very active personal and professional life, is married with 2 children and 3 grandchildren, enjoys skiing, skating, playing chess, travels to international scientific and philosophical conferences, and has authored the seminal works in the field he has named Immortologia. Vishev writes that from the earliest known work of literature, the Sumerian Epic of Gilgamesh, all human intellectual and spiritual history has essentially been a search for a means to attain real personal immortality. The history of views of immortality shows several gradual transitions, from religious pessimism to religious optimism, then to scientific pessimism, and from there to scientific optimism, then to scientific pessimism, then leading toward actual resolution of the problem of the possibility of attaining personal immortality. His view of the state of the science is that in the second quarter of the 21st century, the fundamental theoretical problems of unlimited life extension will be solved, and in the second half of the century, unlimited longevity will actually be achieved. He proposes that there are already some people alive who will never die. In his essay From Postmortalism to Immortology and Homo Immortalis, Vishev writes, "The radical prolongation of human life must pass, it would appear, through 3 stages. The gerontological, when the period of old age is prolonged, the juvenological, when the period of youth is prolonged, and the immortological, as a result of which practical human immortality will be achieved. The attitude taken in such researches should be scientifically based optimism. For amidst possibilities, the pessimist will stubbornly seek out difficulty, whereas amidst difficulties, the optimist persistently seeks and finds possibility." Like Fedorov and the Cosmists, then, Vishev suggests that a major step toward immortality must involve a redirection of attitude, from a general sense of can't be done to a confident can do. Another prominent immortalist today is Danila Medvedev, who, at least in filmed and televised interviews, is in no way lacking in can-do confidence. He contends that since the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russian confidence in scientific solutions to environmental and other problems has drastically diminished. Fears of global warming, economic collapse, and nuclear and environmental disasters have led to a widespread Russian distrust of science and technology. The problem, Medvedev suggests, is one of education. Russians no longer study science as eagerly as they did in the Soviet period, and therefore Russians do not understand what science and technology can do for the world. But the new sciences of transhumanism and immortalism are a step in the right direction. Transhumanists readily accept radical changes such as curing the aging problem, creating artificial intelligence, or uploading the human consciousness into a computer. Their position results from a clear understanding of the opportunities that science and technology provide and from a willingness to reconsider philosophical and cultural norms in view of the changes in the environment. Education in the principles and the goals of transhumanism, then, is the answer to Russia's problem of a lack of confidence in science. Appearing youthful and fit, well-dressed, and speaking in articulate rapid-fire, complete sentences in Russian or English, Medvedev shines in panel discussions and personally exudes the confidence in the future that he says his countrymen currently lack. In Mind Upgrade, a video presentation at a 2004 philosophical conference in Helsinki, Medvedev, then 24, speaking in extremely articulate English and using all the most recent technological terminology, outlines a plan for cognitive enhancement that will allow us to overcome our current human limitations and become not merely superhuman but transhuman. We cannot upgrade the world until we have upgraded ourselves. To get from A to B, he says we must learn to view our brains as software and ourselves as programmers, redesigning our cognitive circuits to eliminate errors or cognitive biases caused by our obsolete apparatus. Eventually, as our brain functions become more nearly mechanical and therefore perfect, we will be able to program our futures for practical self-directed evolution. Someday, perhaps centuries from now, we will be able to upload all our thoughts, memories, and sensations into advanced versions of today's microchips. Immortality will be endless preservation in the cosmic databank. Man and machine will be one with the cosmos. As a blogger, Medvedev keeps readers informed of his latest interests and aspirations. In a blog entry from May 2007, he writes that if or when he attains superintelligence, there's no single human value that I expect to keep. Books are of no use to superintelligence. Love and sex are something many of us already want to get rid of, a dark vestige of our evolutionary past. Games are inferior forms of Monte Carlo simulations and evolutionary algorithms. Work will no longer be needed, although thought alone would accomplish everything I might ever need, and the food I would need would be measured in ergs, not in calories. Here as elsewhere, in the point of view Medvedev writes from would seem to be that of one who has already evolved beyond normal humanity, but who is still willing to help and encourage those of us who have not gotten that far. In the future that Medvedev foresees, the difference between man and machine will be insignificant, but in reading and listening to him, one may get the clear impression that the more we are silicon, the less we are carbon, the more intelligent and therefore virtuous Medvedev believes we will be. As a director of a cryonics laboratory, Medvedev is in the business of freezing brains and even entire heads of people who wish to become immortal when adequate technology becomes available. In 2011 documentary Knocking on Heaven's Door, aired as part of BBC4's Storyville series, the British filmmaker George Carey and his producer Teresa Shervas visited Medvedev's library and interviewed him about his work. Most striking about this sequence in the video is the location and appearance of the laboratory. This most futuristic of technologies was being practiced not in a shiny steel and glass science tower, but in something that looked like a small farm chicken house, with a muddy, unpaved pathway, various pieces of metal junk strewn here and there, and a preservation chamber that looked like a frosty ice cream vat, out of which, when opened, a foggy greenish cloud emerged. The contrast between the rhetoric, equally rapid, fluent, and brimming in confidence, whether in English or in Russian, about the inevitable future of transhuman immortality, and the ramshackle setting in which that rhetoric was uttered was enormous, but at the same time so characteristic of Russia, where world-shaking ideas have often stood out so starkly from their backgrounds, great novels from prison camps, rocket science from wooden huts, a vision of Holy Sophia from a desk in the reading room of the British Museum, cosmic projects from a humpback trunk doubling as a thinker's bed. Conclusions about the Russian Cosmists. Quote, "Magic was not the science of the past. It is the science of the future." Colin Wilson from The Occult, A History. One of Fedorov's favorite Bible passages was, "Truly, truly, I say to you, he who believes in me will also do the works that I do, and greater works than those will he do, because I go to the Father." John 14:12 RSV. Fedorov interpreted these words as Christ's charge to his true followers to match and outdo his own miraculous works, i.e., in terms of the common task, to resurrect not only one Lazarus, but all our dead ancestors. But perhaps in repeating this passage so often, Fedorov also intended that his own followers should meet and even go beyond the projects he was assigning. And this is what the Russian Cosmists have been attempting to do in the century since Fedorov's death. As noted throughout this study, the Cosmists have also developed positions divergent from and even opposed to Fedorov's, and have readily discarded aspects of Fedorov's teachings that they consider irrelevant, obsolete, unacceptable, or indefensible. But at the same time, they have retained much. All the Cosmists have followed Fedorov's teaching that knowledge must be active, whether spiritual or scientific. All have subscribed to a sense of wholeness, a view that man and the cosmos are interrelated, that the individual and the community complete and fulfill each other, that life is in one way or another present throughout the cosmos, that whether called God or ether or some other term, a supreme source and support of life and energy is present throughout the cosmos, and that we and our planet are not alone. All the Cosmists share a sense that throughout the cosmos much more is unknown than known. The present state of knowledge is inadequate, and searching through the past to find knowledge applicable to the future, we may find that current disparaged and currently unimagined scientists, alternative sciences, the parasciences, pseudosciences, could assist or supplement what we need to know. Therefore, nothing should be dismissed simply because it has been ignored or rejected by the accepted wisdom of our time. All the Cosmists, no matter how learned, share Fedorov's skepticism towards whatever was considered axiomatic to the learned. All drew at least some of their ideas or inspirations from the higher magic sources, usually labeled esoteric or occult. All were also keenly aware of the Russianness of their ideas and activities. They sensed that their best work would not and possibly could not have been done elsewhere. Those who were forced to live in exile remained thoroughly Russian in orientation and attitude. Those who could not work freely in Russia nevertheless preferred to stay, facing the probability of a term in a remote prison camp, the possibility of a bullet in the back of the head. As noted at several points in this study, Otchestveni, native, is an adjective often used today in reference to Cosmism and the Cosmists. Sympathetic scholars in Russia have gone to great lengths to emphasize that Cosmism is a Russian development, something of their own that Russians can take pride in, even if foreign philosophers and intellectuals ignore or disparage the movement. For these scholars, Cosmism is the answer to Shaidev's question, what of cultural or intellectual value has Russia given the world? An early reviewer of the philosophy of the common task wrote that Fedorov is a unique, unaccountable, and incomparable phenomenon in the intellectual history of mankind. The 1,000-year existence of Russia has been justified by the birth and life of Fedorov. No one anywhere on earth can now reproach us for having failed to offer up to the ages a fruitful thought or a labor begun by genius. In Fedorov, in and of himself, lies the atonement for all sins and crimes of the Russian people. Similar tributes to Vernadsky, Tsiolkovsky, Florensky, and other major cosmists, hailing them as thoroughly Russian geniuses, regularly turn up in the secondary literature today. Its homegrown native quality, then, is one of the most appealing features of Cosmism to Russians today, especially given what they view as a constant, relentless criticism on the part of American and Western European intellectuals towards Russian traditions, values, and policies. In history, Russians have long been accustomed to life under all-embracing ideologies and totalitarian systems. Cosmism is often seen as a positive, spiritually advanced alternative to the previous all-embracing ideology of communism, a more comprehensive 1,000-year plan to replace the 5-year plans that didn't work. Cosmism does not emphasize such current Western priorities as free elections, free press, minority rights, and political and cultural diversity. Does not seem to lessen its appeal in Russia. Traditionally, Russians have not participated actively in the process of government. As Sergei Karamurza, a current political ideologist, has written, voting is an ancient ritual found in all forms of democracy, from clan democracy to modern liberal democracy. The ritual is only the conclusion of a process by which interests are reconciled and a decision is reached that satisfies all influential groups. In a parliament, voting is a ritual that symbolizes competition, where victory goes to the strongest, even if only by one vote. In Soviets, voting is a ritual of agreement. Here people try to achieve unanimity. Whether in Tsarist or Soviet times, governing has been for royals and driven political leaders, while ordinary citizens have sought and found fulfillment elsewhere in religion, work, family life, science, literature, and other activities in a very rich national culture. Cosmism does not change this tendency. The major question, do you want to live or do you want to die, is not really a matter for democratic decision. The plan has been determined. Our role is to use all our intelligence and energy to fulfill it. Cosmist politics is not the politics of campaigning for every vote and determining that every vote is counted, but the politics of unanimous voluntarism. And while not all Russians accept this vision of political life, enough do accept it to make Cosmism a total worldview of growing influence. Cosmists who have written about the history of Russian philosophy find that Cosmism offers the ultimate grand synthesis of all Russian thought, Slavophile and westernizing, progressive and conservative, religious and scientific, mystical and realistic, utopian and pragmatic, national and universal. Critics of Cosmism have usually found fault with it for being one-sided, that side being the opposite of whatever set of beliefs the critic is writing from. In the Soviet period, dialectical materialists found that Cosmists irrational and mystical. In the post-Soviet period, critics have accused Cosmist thinkers of crypto-Stalinist totalitarianism. Religious critics have found Cosmism to be too technological, too materialistic, and too mechanistic, whereas scientific immortalists and other futuristic materialists have dismissed the spiritual dimensions of their predecessors as residue from the previous centuries. The very Russian orientation that makes Cosmism attractive to so many Russian intellectuals is precisely what has made it of so little interest to many foreigners. Russians can appreciate, for example, Fedorov's glorification of autocracy, even if they disagree with it. For a strong Russian dictator is at least ours, and for us, even if he is ruthless in his native beneficence. The current rising nostalgia for Stalin and unfaded loathing for the West's friend Gorbachev illustrates this point. Even liberal agnostic Russians can understand why intelligent believers revere the Orthodox Church. But Western intellectuals may well find it difficult to believe that any profound futuristic thinker could sincerely endorse, as Fedorov did, the ideals of nationalism, orthodoxy, and autocracy. Or that a great scientist like Tsiolkovsky could seriously find higher truths in the mumbo-jumbo of Madame Blavatsky's secret doctrine. Or how a genius like Frowensky, a Russian Leonardo da Vinci, could argue that the mathematics behind Einstein's theory of relativity proved the existence of God. Western readers who have not devoted their professional lives to the study of the paradoxes in Russian culture, literature, and thought might very well wonder if Cosmism isn't precisely what Mary Shelley was warning us about in Frankenstein, or what Yevgeny Zamoyatin, George Orwell, and Aldous Huxley depicted as dystopia in We, 1984, and Brave New World. The Cosmists and their ideas may suit the Russians, but what relevance and value do they have for the rest of the world? We all know that our planet, our civilization, and especially our Western ways of life are ailing, but do the Cosmists propose cures that are even worse than the ailments? In the end, are they at best just brainy kooks and at worst dangerous apologists for totalitarian ideals? Why take them seriously? A first Western response might be that even though today's Russia no longer compels the attention it did when the USSR was considered the primary enemy of Western democracy, Russia is still a major power and an important potential partner in any future international attempt to create a better world order. The more we can all know about the traditional cultural and intellectual tendencies of this partner, the better, and the Cosmists present as clear and deep a look as any into the past, present, and possible future tendencies of what has traditionally been called the Russian soul. But there are more and better reasons to know about the Russian Cosmists than the need to understand an important neighbor and partner. We in the West can sometimes be too complacent about our intellectual, cultural, and political superiority, too eager to assume that the values that we consider characteristic of our Western democracies are or should be, at least global if not universal, applicable to all our fellow residents of this planet, if not to our extraterrestrial neighbors as well. Positions taken by the Russian Cosmists can challenge us to re-examine some of these assumptions, and perhaps even offer a preview of positions that we may surprise ourselves by entertaining more seriously for ourselves in the future. For example, if degradation of the environment, economic instability, terrorist threat, or some other problem were to lead to a prolonged sense of crisis, it is conceivable that demands could arise for a less democratic and much more authoritarian form of government to undertake necessary, if unpopular, policies that democratic institutions often debate but never seem to enact. For most of us, still looking back at the 20th century, a totalitarianism can only mean the repugnant policies of a Hitler or a Stalin, a Mao or a Pol Pot. But unlikely as it sounds, could there be such a thing as benign totalitarianism? Plato thought there could be, and many of the Cosmists would agree. For Fedorov, government as it ought to be would be an ideal Russian autocrat exercising total authority, spiritual, political, aesthetic, and economic, over the universal common task. For Solovyov and the religious Cosmists, the one to lead us all in every way should be the God-man, the individual of supremely advanced spiritual development. For Berdyaev, we should all look to the great creative artists. For Vernadsky, Tsiolkovsky, and many of today's active Cosmists, leading scientists should be the charge of humanity's future. Unlikely as it may seem today, the liberal democratic model for future world governments may become less attractive than it is today. And the matter of who should have total or near total authority to govern an inevitable global union could become a pressing question in the future. The Russian Cosmists have at least provided a starting point for the negotiations. Another idea, whose time has not yet come outside Cosmist literature, but surely will, is the problem of overcoming death. The Cosmists challenge us to consider precisely what death is, whether it is simply a cessation of all our chemical and electronic activity, or something more, and whether its elimination is indeed possible, and if so, desirable. As Socrates famously argued in the Apology, we do not know what death is. Perhaps it is bad, perhaps neutral, perhaps even a good thing. We simply do not know. But to regard death as something evil to be feared and avoided at all costs is to pretend to know what we do not know, an act of hubris in Socrates' view. So should we direct all human intelligence and energy toward the elimination of death when we do not know what death is? And if we think we know what death is and agree that in the future death should be eliminated, can we go on to agree the past life should be restored to all our ancestors? If so, how far back should the resurrection go? Should we include Neanderthals, great apes, or back even further? And what is the life that we shall be trying to restore? Will it include present memories and present problems? Or will it be starting again with a clean slate? In thinking about the details of resurrection, we can quickly slip into absurdity, but the problems are serious. Not simply the technological, but also the social, cultural, and moral aspects of the possible elimination of death and restoration of life are issues which the cosmists today and others in the future will be addressing. The standard cosmist answer to such questions and apparent absurdities is that sometime in the future we will know what today we do not know. This admirable faith in the inevitable evolution and growth of human knowledge is one of the features of Cosmism that other schools of thought might profitably borrow from. Other important future discussions to which the Cosmists have already made significant contributions have to do with the possibility of uniting things that now appear disparate. Religion, science, art, and magic, tradition and progress, various fields of knowledge and activity, diverse cultural traits, not to mention all the diametric oppositions and contradictions that Berdyaev lists as being united in the Russian soul. But we may ask, can and should the many be squeezed into one? Today we emphasize the value of diversity, biological, ethnic, cultural, the value of each individual particle as assuming that if each thrives, so will the whole. But when does diversity become disintegration? For example, a problem of ethnic unity versus diversity, how can a country with a well-developed culture accommodate distinctly alien customs on a large scale and still preserve its own distinct culture? In the interests of diversity, should women be free to wear veils in a country like France, or wear mini-skirts in a country like Saudi Arabia? And in biological diversity, how far should we go to protect the interests of many different species against the interests of the dominant one? Should we, for example, prevent construction of a public park in order to preserve the habitat of an endangered salamander? Generally, equality and biodiversity are not ultimate values for the Russian cosmists. For the most part, the cosmists take the position opposite ours, and assume that if the whole is orderly and harmonious, the individual particle will be secure and well. If conflict should arise between the interests of the individual particle and the interests of the whole, the cosmists would almost unanimously, Berdyaev being the possible dissident, prefer the interests of the whole. Thus, if beyond Russia in the future global village, with every part wirelessly connected to every other part, if the common interest should happen to be considered more important and the particular individual interest less important, if the drive to forge unity should happen to overcome the drive to preserve diversity, the Russian cosmists again will have prepared a way. Another contribution the cosmists have made, but again not universally accepted, is their attempt to rediscover possible spiritual and scientific truths in certain discarded, pre-modern bodies of knowledge, such as astrology, alchemy, Kabbalah, and other traditional occult or esoteric researches. The Russian cosmists, of course, are not alone in reintroducing certain aspects of esoteric investigation to respectability, the writings of Carl Jung being a prime example. But the degree to which the Russian cosmists, particularly Fedorov, Solovyov, Florensky, Tsiolkovsky, and Chizevsky, have attempted to transform esoteric sources into intellectually respectable, though still controversial philosophy, theology, and science, can be regarded as a significant contribution to at least the Western esoteric tradition, if not to Western thought as a whole. As an academic subject, Western esotericism has in recent decades gained a substantial following, with programs at reputable institutions in the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands, and other countries offering undergraduate majors and granting advanced degrees. Study of the Russian cosmists, bridging the traditional gap between exoteric and esoteric knowledge, could be a valuable addition to the curriculum of these programs. Exchanges between cosmist institutes in Russia and programs in Western esotericism in American and European universities could significantly benefit both sides. This is perhaps a narrow academic contribution, but still one worth making. Perhaps the most important contribution the Russian cosmists have made to modern intellectual life, however, is to offer a centered, directed, positive vision in a largely uncentered, rudderless, negative time. In noting the differences between Russian Cosmism and the various schools of Western thought today, several commentators have argued that cosmist optimism and cosmist spiritual and scientific conviction are qualities much needed in today's global intellectual atmosphere. Fedorov, Berdyaev, Bulgakov, and Florensky all proposed their ideas in part as a saving alternative to a broken, ailing Western intellectual tradition. And today's cosmists have reinforced their predecessors' intentions. Semenova in particular presents a vigorous critique of today's eco-sophists. Although the Russian cosmists in various branches of the Western ecology movement share the view that military and industrial exploitation is rapidly destroying Earth's natural environment, primarily in pursuit of the corrupt ideal of more wealth and comfort for some and more misery for others, the two tendencies differ dramatically in what can and should be done to correct the problem. In Semenova's view, eco-sophists invite man to humbly accept the position of absolutely equal rights among all living beings. Biocentrism, ecological egalitarianism, insist that man return to a sympathetic and humbling harmonic symbiosis of himself and all living and non-living nature, and eco-sophists are prepared to take to heart in all, but give their noble voluntary blessing to the principle, suicidal for themselves, that the world, nature, and biosphere could peacefully go about its business without man, that it could even flourish in his absence. The eco-sophists, who in Semenova's view represent the best of a bad lot of today's Western intellectual tradition, not only accept human mortality as an unchangeable fact, but even act from a tacit death wish. Assuming that any human attempt to regulate, direct, or heaven forbid improve nature could only result in disaster, the eco-sophists in Semenova's view condemn humanity to remain in a stage of infancy and would prohibit humanity from evolving to maturity. We are, in the cosmist view, still in the early stages of human development. To be sure, we have come far from our first clumsy efforts to rise from a horizontal to a vertical orientation, but we still have much further to go. In the course of our evolution, we have sometimes made mistakes, causing harm to ourselves and to our surroundings, and in our further evolution we shall no doubt make more mistakes. But the faith of the cosmos is that we shall continue to get back on our feet, to grow and learn from our mistakes. As Fedorov wrote, philosophy must become the knowledge not only of what is but what ought to be. That is, from the passive speculative explanation of existence, it must become an active project of what must be, the project of universal action. The project that Fedorov envisioned will not be realized any time soon. Vladimir Solovyov suggested a time frame of perhaps 10,000 years or more. Valuable as they are as stimulants, starting points for further reflection and discussion, at this point still too early to judge whether any of the ideas of Fedorov and the cosmos propose could ever or ever should be realized. But if Kuprevich and some of the more optimistic recent cosmists and immortalists are right on one point, some people alive today may still be around for the span of Solovyov estimated, and will thus be in a better position than we are to render a final verdict. Thus concludes section 1112, and in fact, the entire book, The Russian Cosmists, The Esoteric Futurism of Nikolai Fedderov and His Followers, by George Young. The next time you hear my voice, I will be reading from a book of the OCI, Plant CPU in Defense of the Machine, Book 12 of Ryan's Audiobooks. I will see you then. Olam.